Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined once again by Mark P. Mills. Mark is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a faculty fellow at Northwestern University's McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science, where he co-directs an institute on manufacturing, science, and innovation. Mark, you're also an author. You've got a couple great books out there, Digital Cathedrals, and let's give you a chance to hype this new book that's coming out in October. What are you working on right now? We usually do this kind of self-introduction thing, but I think your episode was one of our most downloaded. My listenership, I think, is pretty familiar with you. If you haven't listened to the first episode with Mark, go back and do that. But I wanted to ask you sort of what you've been reflecting on recently. So what better opportunity to talk about this new book?
Well, recently has been finishing the new book. As you writing a book is like the baton death march towards deadlines that publishers and printers have. But it's called The Cloud Revolution, and the subtitles are these days are summaries of books. The subtitle is how new technologies unleash the next economic boom and a roaring 2020s.
Right.
So there's energy in the book. I have several chapters on energy. I talk about energy technologies. Most of my focus in the book is about the structural and revolutionary changes that are going on in material science, in measurement technologies, transportation, manufacturing machines. But I build a taxonomy that I think will be familiar to people if they think about their history, that suggests that what I call the new normalists, these are the people, mostly economists, who are saying that we should expect the future to be relatively low growth. Every forecast in the Western world is for growth rates of economies to run below 2%.
Right.
They grow fast briefly after recessions like we just went through. Then they grow slowly again. That's the new normal because we're mature economies, we're told. In technology circles, that's the equivalent of saying we've stopped inventing things that are revolutionary. There's nothing new coming along except, you can trade in Bitcoin on your smartphone and hail a cab or get food delivered, quickly by, an app. And we can disrupt the financial industry, or we can disrupt music, or this is an intellectually anemic view of where the world is going. So that's to put it, and not to talk only about my book, but put it this way: the first era of digitalization, the first era of the internet and computing, essentially digitalized the things were already information centric: news, entertainment, communications, finance.
Right.
That's about 15 to 20% of our economy. 80% of the economy is in the atoms world, not the bits world. That's been largely undigitalized. So effectively, my book is about what happens and how we are digitalizing the rest of the economy. Part of that's an energy story. I covered that, but it's really not just an energy story. So the Cloud Revolution, you can find it at Amazon right now. You can pre-order. And if the printer and the publisher behave, it'll be out on October 5.
Sounds great. So our first interview was very comprehensive. I was really happy with it. I was just re-listening to it. It was a good deep dive and lots of great anecdotes, like your history combating the splitting wood, not atoms folks back in the day. So again, if you haven't listened to it, check it out. But Mark, I'd wanted to have you back to talk a little bit about what I think is really the crux of the renewable energy transition, which is intermittency and energy storage. I also wanted to get a little bit into some sort of geopolitical considerations with you, but storage, batteries, maybe touching on hydrogen a little bit. Someone who's been influential to me is this gentleman named Mike Conley, who has talked a lot about wind and solar. What's fundamental about them is that they are fuelless systems, and that basically the effort to create storage or to firm these resources is about creating fuels out of these fuelless sources. So I wanted to chat with you a little bit about, what are the features of high quality storage? And we can talk about that in very kind of abstract terms, including the variety of technologies that are out there. But I guess, the focus today was on batteries. So maybe we can sort of start there and compare those to other forms of storage, or just talk more abstractly about fuelless and fueled systems.
Well, I think the first thing to start with is a taxonomy of what we mean by storage, and of course, why storage is important. It's not hard to store rocks or steel, right, or lumber. I mean, capital fixed goods are pretty easy to store. The only issue you have in one's mind is how much money you want to spend on extra stuff in storage. Spare parts, let's call it, right? But what keeps humans alive and society operating is food and fuel, and they're the same thing. So one of the greatest challenges of all time has been storing fuel for people, fuel to operate society. Everything has to be fueled. Fuel is consumed, so it has to be provided in real time always to human beings. We store food for a little while, but not long, in fat cells, right? And they're very hard to recover the energy from fat cells. I mean, the human body is maybe the avatar for what perfect storage is. You want it to be stable, hard to get rid of, cheap and easy to put in, and difficult to destroy, right? We all know if we gain weight, how hard it is to lose weight. Yeah. That's the nature of storage. Storing food, though, before humans eat it, and storing fuel, because it's always been difficult. This is true since the pharaohs' times. So revolutions in storage are what made civilization possible, storing the evanescent consumable commodities of civilization. So how do you store food? Well, what are the features of storage? Well, storage needs to be cheap. Mm-hmm. First order, it needs to be cheap. If it's not cheap, then you're increasing the cost of the thing you're consuming, whether it's food or gasoline or electricity. It needs to be extraordinarily stable. You don't want to put the thing in storage, have it disappear while it's in storage. So or differently put, it's the efficiency of the storage. You can never put 100% in storage and get 100% out, unless it's a rock, right? So commodities tend to degrade in storage, food and fuel. You actually consume energy to store energy. You want it to be easy to use. So depending on different metrics have different qualities of ease of use for convenience. Easy to get it into storage, easy to get out of storage. Right? Those are the key features that all storage matters. So sometimes storage is really hard. So you don't store the thing you're using, you store the intermediate product and make the thing you're using later. Let's use an example that's obvious, an epoxy. If you want to store a glue, you can't store it by mixing the two parts in advance. It won't be a useful epoxy. You store the separate components, which are essentially inert until they're combined. So that's how we store electricity for most of history. We store the primary fuel. We store coal, we store wood if you burn it, oil, natural gas. And the cost of storage is a significant determinant of the cost of electricity. The cheaper the storage, I mean, the primary cost of the fuel matters, and the fuel to where you need it matters, right? I mean, if we'll use natural gas as a good example, coal's the same. If you acquire the cheapest fuels someplace, you want to get it to where you want to have it useful to you. And the question you have then is, where is the best place to store it? How do I store it? So let's talk about electricity, because that's what storage really means to people today. Mm-hmm. Because we don't store much electricity. We just don't. Right. That's because it's really hard to store at high quantities. And lithium batteries are the most remarkable change in electricity storage in a century and a half. And the three gentlemen who essentially collectively invented the lithium battery got the Nobel Prize 2 years ago, deservedly so. It's not too often you get a Nobel Prize for a battery, so to speak. So, right. And the first indication of using lithiated chemistry to store electricity was done by a guy named Whittingham, who worked for Exxon. He did this at Exxon Research in New Jersey in the 70s, and from there we waited till the 90s before Sony commercialized the technology in a very expensive batteries for portable electronics. The rest, as they say, is history. 20 years later, we have electric cars. That's because the lithium battery, in energy density terms, which matters for storage, if you have a portable device, is roughly 400% better than a lead acid battery. That's a big change.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's why storage matters. But lithium batteries are terrific, but they're terrible ways to store electricity, economically speaking, and convenience-wise, compared to, say, just storing natural gas in a cavern below ground or storing oil in a tank above ground. To give you an idea how terrible they are in relative economic terms, if you have a smartphone, you're not going to run it on oil. So we're not talking about smartphone electricity storage, where trivial amounts of electricity are stored. Mm-hmm. I mean, to give you a sense of scale first, I should back up. So, smartphone, everybody has one. pretty much 90% penetration in North America and the Western world. This smartphone has battery in it. Everybody knows that. They wear out usually in a few years, which is annoying, but that's the nature of the batteries. It's not a plot. It's the nature of the electrochemistry of batteries. They wear out. So the roughly 1 million electric cars in North America right now, electric vehicles, have batteries that or battery chemistry that's equivalent to 1 billion of these.
Okay.
So there's a billion cars in the world. So if we're going to electrify, forget the grid. We're just going to talk about cars here for a second.
Sure.
So 1 million electric cars, 1 billion smartphones. Let's go to a billion cars, and there's a billion cars in the world, more than a billion. We can do arithmetic here. That's 1,000 times that. So now we're up to 1 trillion smartphones worth of batteries. Trillion is actually a big number. This has profound implications for mining all the relevant materials, processing them. And the implications are easy to express again arithmetically. Because again, I'll stick with storing energy for cars. We can come to storing for the grid. The grid's a bigger problem than cars because the amount of energy is bigger. And if we electrify cars, we're going to have a double whammy. We're going to have more storage on the grid if we're going to go the route of having episodic power on the grid. But right now, the world produces around 5 million tons per day of oil to run vehicles, cars. Yeah. 5 million tons per day. That's a lot of oil. And I'm expressing in tons for a reason, because with batteries, we don't count barrels. We have to count pounds or tons of stuff. So in order to replace the 5 million tons per day of oil for cars, if we use batteries, the very best lithium batteries, we're going to have to increase the quantity of materials we mine each day to 50 million tons per day at mines. So a 10-fold increase in the physical quantity of materials in the world to shift from gasoline-powered and diesel-powered cars to electric cars. That's not a great direction for the environment.
No, I think that's very emblematic, because in the midst of this kind of Dunning-Kruger-like optimism about energy transition towards renewable sources, we're moving in the opposite direction, away from higher quality fuels to lower quality sources of energy. And even when we were moving up the energy density ladder to fuels that were more powerful, more energy dense, that were easier to use, that took hundreds of years. And it just astounds me, the kind of optimism that I see throughout much of the media and much of the establishment, that this is somehow going to be easy, or the kind of rosy, optimistic, open-ended language. I think we talked a little bit about that in our last episode, but and the other theme of that last episode was this magical thinking. You mentioned that these lithium-ion batteries were quite revolutionary, and I think you're saying it was 100x energy density. Are there other chemistries out there, like in terms of this optimistic language we always hear in association with renewable energy? It's that we're not there yet, things are going to get better. You talked about asymptotes, I believe, in our last interview. Is that a similar thing that's happening with battery chemistries, or can we expect miracles down the road?
Well, I'm a believer in miracles. So the question, can you expect miracles down the road, relates to how far down the road,
right?
Because timing matters.
Yeah.
So if we talk about the real long term, the miracle we want to find is a room temperature superconductor that doesn't cost very much, that's stable and safe. Then that really would change the world in ways that lithium batteries haven't. It would be profound. We have no idea how to make such a thing. We are getting closer to making room temperature superconductors. Right now, you need to supercool the metals. So that's sort of the magical thinking there is not crazy. It could happen one day, right. But we don't have no idea how to do that today. So what we're stuck with today is chemistry. And so we've moved to one of the most energetic molecules on the periodic table, lithium. It's very light, very energetic. So we're not going to do much better than lithiated class chemistries, but we can change the lithium chemistries, to your point, to lithium metal, lithium air. There's a whole set of lithium combinations that you could imagine. But this is the critical thing. You want to store a lot of energy in a big machine. The machine has to be manufacturable at a price you can afford or come close to afford, and that's reliable and safe. It takes years, not months, to do that. So let's do the lithium battery trajectory, because in the physical world, we're not talking about how fast you go from imagining a piece of software, making an app and distributing it to consumers. Things that involve atoms involve safety, they involve scale and manufacturing. So the invention of the idea of new chemistry was in the late 70s, lithium chemistry. We didn't have useful batteries until the mid 90s, almost 2 decades. And we don't have a significant proliferation of commercial batteries for almost 2 decades after that. But that I'm talking about, car scales. We're talking about now, we have 10 million electric vehicles in the world using lithium batteries. That's a lot. It's actually trivial in terms of changing the world. It's a couple % of the world's automobiles, but it's, if that, it's actually closer to, if you have 1 billion cars and it's 10 million, you can do your math, right? It's not a lot of cars at the scale of the world, but it's significant. But that timeline I just described, from idea, invention in the lab to commercial product to product at scale at high volumes, 20 years, right? And the significant inflection that will come next, like 10 times more electric cars in the world, which I'm sure will happen, by the way. This is not a dispute anymore. So we get to 100 million. We talked last time about that has no relevance to any of the need for oil. The 100 million electric cars, 200 million electric cars will take a few % of the world's oil demand away, a few %. So, but we'll still have 100 million EVs. So that's another 10 years out, right? And so now we're now in a total of a half a century from the new chemistry to a significant penetration.
Right.
So if a chemist in a lab today comes up with a new chemistry that's profoundly better than lithiated chemistry we use today, realistically, 5 or 10 years, you start to see some commercialization at modest scales at high costs. In another 5 or 10 years before you begin to see some penetration. So these things happen, but to your point, they happen at paces that are very different than aspirations of net zero by 2030 or 2040. These are rhetorically silly aspirations that have nothing to do with what's actually possible in society.
And you've talked before about this, increase in global mining that will be absolutely unprecedented as a part of this transition away from, gases and liquids towards minerals. It seems like there's going to be a lot of competition for that lithium chemistry. It was ironic seeing, I'm not sure if it was a Flex alert from California, but they were actually asking people not to charge their battery electric vehicles because the grid was under so much strain from the heat wave. And this is also in the context of them wanting to shut down Diablo Canyon in a few more years. But let's move and talk a little bit about grid scale storage for the electricity grid. There was a tweet from Elon Musk recently that solar plus Powerall battery ensures your home never loses power. I think you've talked a little bit about the Texas blackout as well, and if the fossil, nuclear, and coal had not been there to back up the system, what would have been there? Batteries, how would they have performed? How long do they last for? I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this, but I think the issue of scale is really important here.
It is. I mean, obviously what matters here is sure, solar plus batteries can do very useful things depending on where you live and how much money you have. It's an expensive way to make electricity at a house, and it can't make all your electricity. You can't put enough solar arrays on a roof to run all your appliances and your air conditioning. But it's perfectly a useful solution for many people. But what happens if it happens to be cloudy when you lose the grid? Well, obviously you have to have enough batteries for how long the clouds are there, or it's at nighttime. How many batteries do you need? Well, if you have a gas pipeline to your house, gas pipelines are extraordinarily reliable. Their failure rates are measured in like the 5 nines, 99.99999% reliable. You can, as long as there's natural gas flowing in the pipes, if you have a backup generator at your house or your business, you can have electricity, right? It's just, you don't have to store anything there. You just run it, just keeps running. So you can have 2 sources of power to a building: wires, which are pretty reliable, 99.9%, buried pipes, and a backup generator. Then you keep data centers, internet running, hospital MRI machines running, lights on, air conditioners going, essentially in perpetuity. You go solar with batteries, and if your battery can last 5 minutes, 5 hours. I mean, so we can look at scale. Here, last year, North America installed the most grid scale batteries in history. There was a 200% increase in grid scale batteries added in 2020, epic level. So in North America now, we have enough grid scale batteries to store 20 seconds of North America's electricity. 20 seconds. So the aspirational forecasts say, well, we have to solve the intermittency problem, we'll build more batteries. So the Energy Information Administration forecasts that what we may have with all the subsidies is a 10,000% increase. 10,000% increase in grid scale batteries added over the next 20 years. That's a pretty big increase by anybody's measure. At that point, we'll have just a little over 20 minutes worth of storage of the North America's electricity. So I did the numbers for the United States. We can roll Canada in because it doesn't change the numbers by more than 10%, as you know. Mm-hmm. So here's the thing that you want to know if you're planning a grid for a country. And we know this from meteorological records. This is not, we don't have to guess this. How often, if we have a wind and solar grid only, which is what people are saying they want, backed up by batteries, which is what they're saying we can do, how often do we have a day or two where the whole continent has no wind and it's under cloud cover? I mean, that's the question I'd want to know if I'm going to have a grid that's will tell you how many batteries you need. If that never happens, you just calculate how often you get that fluctuations every day. Right. So looking back over history, over decades, we find that every decade, there are numerous times, 3 to a half dozen, where the entire continent is under cloud and becalmed for days, not minutes, for days. Mm-hmm. So we're now talking about a 10,000% increase in battery construction for the grid to get us to 20 minutes of storage. What that means is that every 10 years, for several days, every 10 years, there'll be periods of time when nothing runs. Nothing runs. There won't be enough batteries. So you'll remember my 20 minutes. Yeah. Nothing runs. So how will you avoid that problem? Well, you would store energy some other way. What would that be? Oh, I don't know. Piles of coal, caverns full of natural gas, big tanks full of oil, and then build generators. So we're going to build all that extra stuff as a shadow grid to store energy for when we need it, when nature doesn't conveniently give us our sun and wind and we don't have enough batteries. This is epically silly, epically expensive.
We had a road crew outside our hospital, where I'm an emergency physician, and they ended up digging up the two main cables that supplied the hospital. And so we went into a critical situation. We have diesel backup generators that
of course you do.
Kicked into gear. We had to shut off a lot of areas of the hospital, but we got through it okay. It took actually about 2 or 3 days to
so how many so you don't have full backup, obviously. If you have to power some things off, you haven't sized the generators for full backup, which data centers size their generators for full backup. Yeah. And then you have to size your storage tanks to run your backup for
exactly. Yeah.
Or typically they hours, but in the case of a cable that's been dug up, you're going to need days of fuel. And so you have trucks coming in with fuel to keep your hospital running.
Absolutely. And if that system fails, then all the ventilators shut down, right? It was a pretty scary moment for us. You mentioned the data centers with diesel backup generation. I was reading a story, I think it was from Australia, and this was around household storage, and they were talking about, comparing some DIY battery storage with a Tesla Powerall, and, during a blackout that had affected a number of communities. And, they were all talking about how long each of their battery systems lasted for. And in the fine print of each of these three profiles, they'd all had a diesel generator that they ended up relying on towards the end. So I've heard that with some of these data centers, there's been a lot of installations now, particularly in unstable grids like in California, of diesel reciprocating engines, for instance, to provide that. You mentioned that there's been this huge addition of batteries to the grid. Has there been a concomitant addition of diesel generation as well?
Yeah, but yes, I mean, it's off the charts growth in the residential and business installation of backup generators. Typically, when possible, they're natural gas fired reciprocating engines if you have gas service, or it's oil if you don't have that. You can do the test and call your local Generac or Kohler distributor and find out how long it'll take you to get a generator right now.
Right.
The sales went off the chart in California. It's true all over the world. So this is the irony, is that in order to promote batteries, wind and solar, and make the grid less reliable, what's going to happen is that people are going to, everywhere that they experience blackouts, which will increasingly happen, they'll buy more generators, put oil tanks in the ground and buy oil. It doesn't use that much oil because you're only running them when there's no battery power, but it uses a lot of capital.
It's tremendously inefficient. Yeah, tremendously inefficient.
It's capital inefficient in a sense. These engines are very efficient thermodynamically. It's just a very inefficient way to make electricity. If you calculate it in terms of those cents per kilowatt hour,
yeah,
right? So when you use a generating asset 24/7, you can produce electricity, I'll pick a number, 10 cents a kilowatt hour.
Sure.
If you use that same asset, the same capital asset, 1/10 the time, that's about $1 a kilowatt hour.
Right.
It actually it's a little higher because you know machines that have to be maintained when they don't work as well when you run them episodically. But anyway.
Sure. Yeah.
So it's the magical thinking on this is silly, but it's different than, of course, there'll be more batteries, and they're very useful.
Yeah.
Right. For a lot of applications, what I'd rather have at your hospital, for example, is enough batteries for the frequent little interruptions, right? Minutes, maybe half an hour. So I don't have to kick on the diesel generators for that. And because if a generator comes on for an hour and it goes off, there's all kinds of issues with it. You just really want to run it for a while.
Right.
And then you have both. These hybrid solutions are tremendously effective way to have backup power, but they're not your primary power.
Yeah. You know, my producer actually wrote a really interesting paper recently it was actually on prospects for nuclear energy in sub-Saharan Africa, but he was looking at a number of different grids, Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana. And one of the stats that really stuck out to me was, and I might get this wrong, forgive me, Dylan, for that, but the amount of off-grid diesel generators was something like 8 to 13 times the generating capacity of the actual grid. So you have this grid defection under investment in the actual grid, which impacts reliability, causes people to defect, and creates this cycle. And it seems, when I was reading it, I was like, this is kind of the route that California is taking. Like they're heading towards creating a third world grid. Which will have, they can afford it right now, and they can import power from their neighbors. But this is fundamentally what's occurring, and it's astounding to me.
You're right. Well, actually, they could do more than import power from the neighbors. They can steal it. So if your listeners haven't read recently what California did, they had a backdoor clause in electricity that's being transported across the state from hydropower in Oregon going to Arizona.
Wow.
It goes on transmission lines through California. When California ISO decided they were short power, they usurped the power in transit. Arizona utility complains that they had a duly negotiated contract for transport. But apparently, and I read this, I've got to confess, I have to dig into this deeper, but I believe it's probably true. There's a trapdoor in the clause that the Arizona utilities failed to notice or pay or consider was likely to be enforced, which was that in extremis, the operator of that transmission could take the power in transit, even if they didn't own it. Now, this is going to, obviously what will happen in the future is people will negotiate different kind of contracts, right? Or you won't transit power through California. Right. You buy it from somebody else if they're going to steal your power. So the Western grid is in trouble. The California is on the Western grid. It's one of the many grids in North America, and it's actually worse. It's as bad as you describe, which is remarkable. Germany at least did the honest solution. They built 2 grids. Exactly, so Germany built all its wind and solar capacity at great cost. They kept 70% of the old hydrocarbon grid, which is coal dominated, and they give preference to wind and solar. Fine, whatever, but they keep the other grid available to keep the lights on. Right? Yeah. That should sound expensive. It is, and what a surprise! German electricity is roughly 300% more expensive than North America's electricity.
No, I mean, I guess they've unlike California, they've prioritized maintaining that stability through that parallel generation. They spare some fuel, but I think the industrial consumers as well are spared those high prices, because otherwise they would lose those beautiful vertically integrated corporations that are kind of at the basis of German prosperity.
By insulating the industrial consumers, the money still costs something, so somebody's paying for it.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's why the residential rate in Germany is 300% higher.
Yeah. No, this transmission politics is pretty fascinating. I mean, there's all kinds of fantasies about, putting solar farms in the Sahara to then, high voltage transmitted into Europe as if there'd be no geopolitical considerations or power after. And it's happening in California in a relatively geopolitically stable, political entity. It's unreal. It's unreal.
I mean, and you used the right word. These are fantasies. You're not going to run electric grids from Sahara to Europe. They actually seriously studied it, or from the Sahara across the Atlantic. It's much cheaper and much more reliable to put oil or natural gas or coal on a ship, translate that across the Atlantic, and burn it on this end, or vice versa. It's just a fact. Never mind the damage to the Sahara by covering it with solar panels. There are at least some serious environmentalists who are very worried that people might actually do that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let's shift gears a little bit. There's been some talk of using nuclear as a battery. Is that a good description of what a battery is, or is this a little foolish?
It's foolish. I mean, but there are nuclear batteries, by the way. Yeah. You do know this as a physician. I mean, nuclear batteries for pacemakers. The advantage of a nuclear battery, if you don't need a lot of electricity, but you need it for a long time. Nuclear batteries are terrific. I don't think we're installing any nuclear batteries anymore in pacemakers, because we're doing the rechargeables that are wirelessly rechargeable. Mostly because it's handling the radioactive material, yada yada. It's very low levels of radioactivity, but space probes are all nuclear battery powered rather than active reactors.
Right.
But a nuclear power plant's not a battery. The word battery is fashionable because everybody knows we need batteries to save the grid. So the nukes want to call their power plants batteries, I guess.
They're trying so hard to win the public relations battle.
Check the box. It's not. You could sort of rationalize it this way. Imagine, and this is not crazy imagination, we're going to need big nuclear power plants like we need big hydro dams and big coal plants for a very long time. But there's a lot of applications where you don't want big power plants. And we know we could build. The issue is, can we build them so they're fail-safe, truly fail-safe safety, and they're affordable? But we know it's technically possible to build nuclear reactors that would sort of function like a battery. That is, you would put them in the ground, buried. They'd have an on-off switch. There's no controls required. They just produce electricity continuously for a decade. And when they need refueling, you come back and you swap out the fuel. It's like so it functions in a sense. You could sort of think of that. Rhetorically, that sounds like I've described a battery, right? Mm-hmm. I'm recharging the fuel core with a fresh core. You seal it back up. And these reactors don't have anything that can explode. They don't have anything that's unsafe. They have nothing you can make into weapons. I mean, all that kind of stuff. So that kind of nuclear technology is technically feasible. It's probably going to be economic. I would think, just me guessing, within the decade or so. This is a big deal. So all the off-grid power where I need a 1 to 2 to 10 megawatts for a modestly big village or a small town, this would be spectacular. You don't have to go to the economic challenge of running transmission lines to these remote villages, or mine sites, or industrial facilities, or data centers.
What's your take on molten salt as a storage medium, not as a reactor technology? Because I know that Bill Gates is investing in the natrium reactor, which I think is designed to. I'm not sure if it's designed with the intention to back up renewables or just to create a flexible source. Because I think nuclear is dispatchable, but it's not flexible. So, have you looked into that at all, or just in general the prospect of molten salts for creating flexibility with these sources, or as a storage medium?
Yeah, all of the flexibility is driven by the renewables, specifically wind and solar. So this whole obsession with storing electricity or storing energy in intermediate form. So the molten salt, you would heat the salt up. It just holds the heat. Then you use the heat to make steam and make electricity with hot salt. But you can store energy lots of ways. You can compress air. You can raise rocks up a hill, pump water up a hill. Energy can be stored in all kinds of forms. The issue is always the same. Is it a convenient way to store the energy? Is it the cheapest way to store the energy? Right? I mean, the metrics are always the same. Look, the cheapest way to store energy, I'll say it again, it's really, people don't like it. It's just a fact. The reason oil is a remarkable energy storage media is that it's incredibly stable. It's incredibly safe. It's very hard, despite Hollywood's movies, very hard to light oil on fire. Gasoline is incredibly safe. You think how many cars on the road with morons driving them? I don't mean to insult the morons, but come on. There's remarkably few fires, considering it's cheap to store. It's easy to transport. It doesn't require special tools. It doesn't degrade when it's stored significantly. In economic terms, storing a barrel of oil, 50 cents a month, give or take, could be 20 cents. I mean, all in. So the hardware and the stuff to store it, put it in, get it out, and the amount of energy you get out after putting it in, about 99%, 99.99%. I mean, the oil's still the same. You have to pump it in and out, so you use a little energy to do that. Let's compare that to grid scale batteries, right? In the same terms, barrels of oil, right? So how much do you think a battery costs to store a barrel of oil equivalent of energy for a month? 50 cents for a barrel of oil, 50 cents for a barrel oil equivalent of natural gas, about 10 cents to store a barrel oil equivalent of coal, barrel of oil equivalent in a grid scale lithium battery, $200 a month.
Wow.
$200. And the goal is to cut that in half. Great. You go, girls. So $100 a month versus 50 cents. So is that scalable? No. Will it get better? Sure. Of course it'll get better. Maybe it becomes $50 instead of 200, but that's not 50 cents.
It's that's a pretty daunting set of numbers you've quoted there. I think one of the limits of nuclear energy has been, it is so energy dense. It's very promising. You say it's phenomenologically a revolution, but it's not been easy to transform that, I think, through a prime mover into something that's useful beyond electricity and maybe process heat now. I mean, Václav Smil talks about how, I think he's maybe a lot more pessimistic than you are about technological advancements and promises, and he's like, we haven't got a new prime mover and,
he's just a pessimist in general.
He's a bit of a grumpy Eastern European, I think. Yeah.
He's just no, actually, he and I agree. He's pessimistic about these things making a difference in the next decade that people want to make differences, or 2 decades. They take decades to change.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I would say, if we think in historic terms of the length of time it went from producing the first steam engines to really useful steam engines, the first combustion engines to really useful combustion engines, the first turbines, the really useful turbines, the first solar photovoltaic cells to really useful ones.
Right.
The first photovoltaic cells were deployed by NASA in the 50s. 1950s are invented in Einstein got the Nobel Prize in physics for the photoelectric effect in 1905. First photoelectric cells that we would think of as a solar cell today were not invented until after World War II. So in the 50s, the first cells were deployed by NASA in the late 50s. So we come to essentially the year 2000, more or less, 50 years, before we could figure out how to make them at scale, make them relatively affordable. Nuclear power is actually newer technology. It's the newest technology, the newest phenomenology we've discovered for energy conversion. So photoelectric effect, 1905, nuclear fission, first fission was 1939.
Right.
So we have this very short time period. It's just big picture stuff. Let's just say it's 30 years younger than photovoltaic effect. So if we were just being simplistic, we should expect nuclear to be at the same level of commercial sophistication as photovoltaics in another 20 to 30 years, which I think it will be. And Václav might agree with me on that, but that has no bearing. If it becomes fairly useful in 20 years, it'll take another 20 years after that to scale significantly, society level. So we're talking a half a century again. So all those people who think we have to solve a problem before 2030 or before 2040,
right?
We're not going to be solving any society scale problems before 2030.
Well, and I think I agree with you that it's technologically possible, although, there hasn't been the chance for much advancement in the technology because we just haven't been able to build anything, at least in the West, for, 20, 30 years. I had Jack Devaney on, who's the CEO of Thorcon Power. He wrote a great book called Why Nuclear Energy Has Been a Flop. Yeah. And I mean, he was really saying, that there's a lot of potential. I mean, he's leading a company that's, at the forefront, I think, of advanced nuclear. But he was saying with the regulatory environment that's in effect, particularly as low as reasonably achievable, which basically prices you up to anything above the competition, there's not going to be any of these advancements, at least in the West. And I think that's why he's pinning his hopes on getting something happening in Indonesia, where hopefully, some sanity can be brought to the regulatory process. But I do love your optimism around technology. One of the things that I, when I was preparing for this interview, was looking at was you talk about superconductors, supercapacitors. Is that the storage of static electricity and the improvements that are happening there? Is that I'm not an engineer, so I may be confusing my words here. But supercapacitors, what's your take on that? That's a different
thing, but we can talk about that. That's different. Sure. But let me qualify my optimism. My optimism is realism, not optimism in this sense, because I qualify, as you know, time frames. So magical thinking comes in not when it's not an optimism. You're being one is being silly to think that you can change the laws of gravity, the laws of inertia. And laws of inertia apply to economic systems. It takes time to change things. It takes time to make things safe and reliable. You just can't. This is, I've used it before. I guess it's a chauvinistic analogy these days, but you can't have a baby. 9 women can't have a baby in 1 month. This is engineering is kind of like biology. Things are done in progression. You get better by doing it. Then you do it again. You do it again. That's how you get better airplanes, better cars, better surgery, better medicines, better drugs. Yeah. You do it, but it has to be done sequentially. You can speed it up a little bit by doing some of the sequential things in parallel, to learn things. But then when you sort of focus on the new thing, then it becomes sequential. But so your question's about supercapacitors. Supercapacitors are the only electricity storage means to store electricity, to store the electrons, in a sense, electrical charge. Batteries don't store electrical charge in the form of electrons. They have big fat ions. So if you could visualize the molecule, a lithiated molecule is being as big as a house, let's say, I have a microscope, then the electrons are, the size of a marble. And so I'd rather store the marbles because I can move them faster. So supercapacitors have a virtue which is really magical. They could charge them super fast because they're just electric field, literally in fractions of a second. Yeah. And they store much more electricity than the capacitors that are used. Capacitors are in every electric device. Most people don't know what it is. It's just a way of storing a trivial amount of electrical charge. Supercapacitors can store a lot. They can store 1,000 times more than the regular capacitor, but about 100 times less than a battery. Some new supercapacitors can get to within a factor of 10 of batteries, which is pretty cool. So if you're building something, let's say a drone that you only wanted to fly a 1 pound object 1 mile, and I wanted a battery I could charge like boom. Yeah. You could make a supercapacitor do that. If you had a drone you wanted to fly 50 pounds of something, 50 miles over and over again, you might use a lithium battery. You're probably going to use an engine hybrid lithium battery combination. So the physics of energy systems, if we drew a diagram behind me here, we could make an illustration of storage and make this like a grid. What's fast is you can have velocity with which you can store the energy in and out. And then the other axis could be how dense, because how much energy can I get into the system? How much space does it take to store the energy? Then you'd have to have another axis, how much did it cost me? And in the end, you could make a blended metric, which is what any engineer does. Speed and convenience, you blend them together. You do a make-up number. You say a 0 to 10 on speed, 0 to 10 on convenience. You add the two numbers, and that's my speed and convenience number. Then I put the other axis, cost, because usually money matters. And there's nothing, I'll keep beating that dead horse. Batteries are a really expensive way to store energy. But if you want a smartphone, or if you want to make a light drone, nothing beats it, as long as you don't need too much energy.
Right.
but they'll never get as good as oil. Let me give you another factoid, because the facts matter. The energy density of a battery is measured in watt hours per kilogram.
Yeah.
So, a 60 watt bulb or a 6 watt LED, 1 hour is 6 watt hours. This has a 3 watt hour battery in it, 3,000 milliamp hours, 3 watt hour. So roughly, maybe it's a 9 watt hour. Anyway, it's a few watt hours. Lithium chemistry, the chemistry, not the batteries, can hold 500 watt hours per kilogram. So that's the chemistry. Mm-hmm. To make a battery work, a Tesla battery all in has about 200 watt hours per kilogram, because you have all the assembly and stuff. Petroleum is 12,000 watt hours per kilogram. 12,000 watt hours per kilogram compared to 500. That's the physical chemistry. There's no engineering to close the gap. That's the universe we live in. Those are the atoms and molecules we get to start with. Right. So then what you do is you make a battery which can't ever get 500 watt hours per kilogram, but you don't want to waste too much on the assembly and conversion processes. And you got an internal combustion engine, same thing. If my internal combustion engine were perfect, it could get 12,000 watt hours per kilogram. It isn't. The very best ones waste half of it. So I have 6,000 watt hours per kilogram. The very best electric motors only waste 10% of electricity. So that 500 becomes 450. And the actual battery itself wastes another 20%, so it becomes 300. So I have 300 watt hours per kilogram in a finished operating storage system to deliver energy, and 6,000 watt hours per kilogram in a finished petroleum system to get energy in and out. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That gap can never be closed by spending money, doing subsidies, invoking things will get better if we just spend money on it. This is a gap like saying, well, if I flap my arms harder, I know I can't fly, but if I spend more money, I'll give you $1,000, flap your arms harder, jump off the cliff, try harder. Gravity wins because the aerodynamics of your body, you're not a bird. Mm-hmm. I have to make you into bird. If I want the energy density of an internal combustion engine, that's the equivalent of making a man into a bird. Battery becomes internal combustion engine. There's no transformation that makes that possible. This is why I keep writing and talking about the physics of energy. These are the category errors people make. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that people aren't good and birds are better, or internal combustion engines are always better than batteries. It just means they have very different applications.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to shift gears a little bit to talk about something that I've been referring to as a kind of energy Lysenkoism. And, for those of our listeners that aren't familiar, Lysenko was a Soviet era agronomist who, for ideological reasons, and I think it was kind of a nurture trumps nature reason, rejected genetics and sort of accepted a more of a Lamarckian view to evolution and to plant breeding. So he would take seeds and expose them to kind of icy conditions so that they would be productive in Siberia. And he's been credited as kind of being one of the scientists who is responsible for, more deaths than just about anybody on the planet in terms of scientists, shall we say, maybe a kind of a reverse Norman Borlaug figure. And this was very much an example of, ideology trumping science or and because of the characteristics of the Soviet Union having success. This went on for 20, 30 years and even was adopted, I think, within China. And again, had responsibility for massive famines. And there is some kind of an analogy I'm feeling towards ideology trumping science and engineering and forcing an energy transition, which, from high quality storage mediums and fuels into much lower quality forms of energy, which will have really catastrophic impacts on human well-being. I don't know whether we'll be able to compare that to the impacts of Lysenkoism in terms of starvation, but certainly, as Robert Bryce says, the grid is the network that supports all of their networks. And, in modern societies, these networks are absolutely vital, as in the example of my hospital, but also, water distribution, sewage treatment, and everything else. Right. I'm trying to think if there's any other sort of energy comparisons. I really can't think of any where there's been a sort of ideological or political movement that's tried to force the technology quite so hard. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that analogy?
I think that analogy has a salience. Analogies always have this challenge, as you know. They are not precise, but they're informative. They give you a framework to think about. So I think the Lysenkoism analogy is the right framework on two counts. One of them, ironically, because there's something, Lysenko was onto something that's true, but made a category error again about understanding the underlying science and the relevance of what he knew that was true. And so that's sort of the science bucket. Separate from that, at that time that he was peddling that theory, of course, the communist ethos was that we humans could control everything. So it was not only a-religious and antithetical to religion, it was sort of a-scientific. We control science. We invent everything.
Right.
And we obviously knew we had everyone knows it was a potentate, essentially a dictator that controlled and for a long time. Oh, I'm lost my signal. Hang on a second.
I can still hear you coming through, but
yeah, but I just can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you. Okay. The connection's been a little off, but I think it's more or less been okay.
Yeah, my screen went blank, so I'm gonna just carry on. I'll restart the Lysenko thing, but I can't physically see you because I lost video. But if you've got video, we'll carry on.
I've got video. Yeah.
So the Lysenkoism is actually relevant as an analogy. Analogies have a weakness. They're not precise. Lysenko was onto something which was true, which is that you can acclimate yourself to cold weather. I mean, we know this for pearl divers. Pearl divers are more acclimated to cold water, can hold their breath longer. So there's a band of activities for plants and animals that you can toughen up things, if you like, or change them. But again, to use the analogy, you can't make a human become a bird, right? It's nothing. You also can't change the underlying genetics of human beings, but you can make humans stronger, more resilient to cold. So he was right about something. So this is what the Lysenko analogy is particularly salient here. He was right about that feature of biology, right? That's true, but it's not how genetics works. He's profoundly wrong about how humans get their attributes to become human, and how we get attributes like blue eyes or hair or no hair or all the other attributes which are genetically based. So there's an interaction, and he blurred the categories. We have got that going on in energy without any doubt. We have people saying things which are, strictly speaking, true in a narrow category, are not applicable to the category they're applying it. It's a silly use of the science, but it sounds right, it sounds good, and people want to believe it. And then if you add to that, at Lysenko's time, there was a government that had an agenda, political agenda, about the ascendance of their race and their political system, impose it on their people, and they killed a lot of people because of it. We have, and this has been a complaint of mine, and you're implicitly, explicitly making the same complaint. The discussion about how we fuel and feed society has political elements, there's no question, but we've made it highly political, we politicized it. So if you oppose the vision of all wind and solar, you're obviously not with us as a Democrat or a liberal. If you oppose it, you're obviously a right-winger or a Republican. These are not, electrons aren't Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative. So the physics of energy is independent of that. The implementation of businesses around what we want to have happen is very political. So we've blended the two to our detriment, and so we have plans that are Lysenko-like. Frankly, I think you're correct, and I think it's actually, I think it's unlikely we'll have the consequences of Lysenkoism's resultant starvation of millions of people, but it's arguable that we're moving in that direction. I mean, Bjorn Njellenberg and Mike Schellenberger and others are correctly, as environmentalists, writing about the economic and therefore life costs of misallocation of resources. We're spending extra money on energy, and we should be spending extra money not on energy, but on food and on safety and on medicine and other life-sustaining activities. Money is a limited commodity. So if we politically drive ourselves towards energy systems that are inherently less reliable and more expensive, that's to the extraordinary detriment of the poor of the world. It's obviously not nice for wealthy countries. They can tolerate it. The poor can't.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. In terms of trying to understand the energy choices that are being made in America, there was a really interesting conversation I heard recently between Robert Bryce and Emmett Penny. And Emmett was talking about, political patronage and path dependency, and using the example of ethanol, for instance, and the way that those political interests have sustained that as a fuel, despite it being pretty illogical from a physics sense. But what he said was, the renewables industry have been incredible sort of political patrons of the Democratic Party. The natural gas industry has been incredible political patrons of the Republican Party, and wind and solar and natural gas have an incredible patronage relationship together. And so that's kind of explaining why we're embarking on, what Meredith Angwin calls this fatal trifecta of over-reliance on weather-dependent resources, just-in-time gas, and imported energy. And why we're heading towards, this kind of third world-like grid instability if we sort of keep this up, and the implications that has. It's truly astounding.
Well, I think the patronage it is a polite way of describing kleptocracy. Yeah. But you could have patronage without having the kleptocracy. You get both mixed up, and outright corruption. Of course, all governments are subject to corruption, but even honest corruption, let's call it, where the patrons get what they want and align themselves with the party that for whatever reason it becomes fashionable to be liberal and pro-wind, and therefore, you label the conservatives as fashionably being liking the old stuff, oil and gas and the hydrocarbons. It's unfortunate. I will say, and this is where I am being optimistic, and I have some history to suggest that I could be right. I think that in North America, at least, not so sure about Europe, but I think probably Europe, we're doing this as an experiment, and we'll be doing it increasingly. California, Texas made some mistakes. Other states will. Some provinces have. I think we will probably find most of the population don't like the experiment. They won't like the higher costs and the lower reliability, and we'll reverse course. And so we'll have wasted some money. We'll waste some time. I think that's bad, but I think the alternative is worse. And by that, I don't mean, not doing the experiment. I mean, not having a society that has this kind of, freedom to make mistakes. We don't have all-wise dictators that can tell us what the right path is. I think I know what the right path is. I think history and evidence suggest that what I and many other people think is the right energy future for the world in the near term is we have the facts on our side. But everybody, you have to argue the facts. And sometimes it's not obvious what the facts are, because we live, again, in a society largely where we're allowed to argue what we think the facts are. So that's a long way of saying I'm optimistic that we'll do the experiment. We probably won't go as far as Germany in the United Kingdom in doing the experiment. But by that I mean with such a large percentage of the electricity coming from unreliable power. But a few states are doing it. And the outcomes in the next couple of years are likely to be very unpleasant.
And I think the political blowback is really quite likely to be, a populist one, because these energy policies end up being so economically regressive.
They are. I mean, look, they're higher cost. No matter what they say, they keep saying it's cheaper. The advocates, it's not cheaper. Mm-hmm. And then, well, if it's not cheaper, we have to do it because we're saving the planet in the future. Okay, let's just be honest about it then. It's not cheaper. Electric cars are not cheaper. Yeah. They're not going to get cheaper for a very, very long time, maybe never. The average EV costs 30 to 50% more than the average internal combustion engine. And it's all tied up in the fact of the battery and its materials. It's a 1,000-pound fuel system to replace 60 pounds of gasoline. Mm-hmm. This is really not a good idea on average. There are situations where it is a good idea, but on average, it's not.
Yeah. Mark, I wanted to shift gears in the last little section that we have here. I've heard you in other interviews dabbling in a bit of geopolitics, and I'm quite interested in trying to understand what's going on between China and the West, particularly as it relates to energy. From a very abstract point of view, it looks like China imports plenty of what we can call sort of high quality, reliable energy. And has taken to making a major export, lower quality, unreliable energy. And just, again, I really enjoy sort of geopolitics and realpolitik. It would be very tempting to me if I were, a rising superpower that was vying with the United States to assist that country in fragilizing its most essential infrastructure, being the grid, the network of all networks.
Yeah.
Do you feel like I'm being a little conspiratorial here, or does that hold water, do you think?
Well, it might in fact do. I mean, we can do it without being Machiavellian. But Machiavelli was right. And governments and bad people do conspire against other governments. We know this. This is human nature, unfortunately. So let's calibrate something. Then what you just said makes all sense in the world. If we take the International Energy Agency's aspirational energy plan, which they released a few months ago, this is their plan to go beyond Paris, and Paris on steroids, if you like, and to reduce the world's energy consumption, to make 75% in a plan of all net new energy supply coming from wind and solar, massive expansion of batteries, massive reduction in coal, oil, and gas use. By 2050, a plan which is genuinely fanciful. It's a plan which Fatih Birol, the head of IEA, said requires that the world stop exporting oil and gas now, not in the future, not 2030, but now. That's what plans. In that year 2050, we'll use in 1973, when the infamous oil embargo happened that changed the energy world. So China knows that. Everybody knows that. That's being serious. The world's going to use lots of oil and gas for a very long time, even if we're hyper aggressive and all the other stuff. So now here's something else we do know. China's the biggest importer of oil in the world. It's on track to being the biggest importer of natural gas in the world. Of the 7 regions of the world that comprise 80% of the world's GDP, U.S., North America is one of those regions. The others, China, Japan, Europe, India. If you look at those 7 regions, only one is a net exporter of energy, North America. All the rest are net importers of energy. And their net import dependence is rising even with their Paris plans. So here's the United States. Let's use North America again because we have an integrated energy system, largely, Keystone aberration aside. Here's North America is not only self-sufficient, it's a net energy exporter, and it's the largest oil and gas producer on the planet. Not just a net exporter, but the largest producer. Self-sufficient and exporting fuels. Fuels which will be essential to the world for the foreseeable future. What happens if we switch over to the wind solar battery path? We stop producing that energy, which constitutes something on the order of about $400 billion a year of North America's GDP. And we have to import minerals and materials, solar panels, the materials for solar panels, the materials for batteries, all of that stuff, because it's all mined stuff. We're not expanding mining in the United States at all. We're not expanding it fast enough in Canada. So we switch North America from self-sufficiency and exports to imports, not of $400 billion a year of stuff, but to about $800 billion a year of stuff. So it's $1 trillion per year net negative trade to the economy of North America. And it's a profound switch in the geopolitical alignments because, to your point, China has made the decision to do the processing of all those chemicals and minerals. They are a net exporter of many of the battery chemicals and refined materials that are needed for batteries, for wind turbines, solar panels. They're an exporter of solar panels. North America gets 90% of its solar panels from Asia. We get 80% of all the critical components for wind turbines from overseas and half of them from Asia. So this is a unprecedented, self-inflicted geopolitical mistake.
Wow. No, I mean, there's so much talk of in the UK, the slogan is the Green Industrial Revolution, to try and harken back to that sort of moment in history. But there was an interesting article looking at the wind supply chain. And there's a struggling Scottish factory that was just doing the most low-tech work of making the masts for the wind turbines. And it was, I think kind of set up by the parent company as a way to sort of win the contract, but they rapidly shut down the plant and went to Vietnam where they could roll steel much cheaper. And these are not jobs creation programs in the countries that we think they are.
Well, the job creation programs for other countries.
Yeah. So it's
they're economic programs for other countries. It was a brilliant move on China's part. It's very difficult to open mines in North America. Easier in Canada than the United States, but still hard there. What's more difficult are opening up the processing facilities, the refining plants you need to take the raw ores and make them into final product minerals for everything, by the way, not just for batteries and wind turbines and solar arrays, but for all the petrochemical products that society needs. So these are very dangerous ideas, politically, geopolitically, and economically, being dressed up with pretty words, green industrial revolution. No, it's not. It's not a green industrial revolution. It's actually not green because we're digging up stuff, processing. It's the same chemical industry as everything else. So whether it's brown or green is irrelevant. It's the same thing, and just lots more of it, because each unit of energy delivered wind, solar, and batteries requires 10 times more materials to be dug up, processed with chemicals, and moved and built. 10 times. So it's a profound move backwards in environmental terms, but it's a profound move backwards geopolitically, and it's profoundly anti-economic. By that I mean productivity is what drives wealth. Productivity comes from reducing the inputs to get the same output. You want fewer people, fewer materials, less mining per unit of output. The so-called green revolution goes backwards. Humanity has not done that in 10,000 years. That's why I don't think we're going to do it very long, because it's not, to use a word, sustainable.
Right. Just, I guess, one last question. I mean, China has built quite a large renewables fleet. I've heard some analysis suggesting that is an effort to sort of fuel spare, because, as you're mentioning, they are a net importer of energy. The Straits of Malacca are pretty tight and geopolitically, geostrategically vulnerable. Is that what's motivating them to build out such a large renewables fleet? I think of, a nation that's largely run by engineers might see some of the flaws from intermittency, but I think there's no question that Germany, for instance, it is fuel sparing. Their emissions have come down slightly. They're burning slightly less fossil fuels. Do you think that's the rationale, or is it just to sort of convince the rest of the world, hey, we're doing it, you should too?
Well, I'll be cynical. It's the latter. So, doubtless all your audience knows, 2/3 of China's electricity is produced by burning coal. China is participating in the planning construction of new coal plants, not just in China, but around the Asian penumbra, to the tune of construction programs that are planned and underway, far bigger than the entire still existing U.S. grid of coal plants. In fact, China and Asian firms, as of this year, have underway plans to expand coal mining, which will lead to, within the decade, an increase in the coal mining of 2 billion tons a year. That's 3 times as much coal as the United States still mines. So they're obviously not stupid, to your point. They have a very stable and reliable and inexpensive grid. Sure, they have a huge renewables or wind and solar program. It's a big grid. So, what's wrong with, I'll pick a number, 10 or 20% of electricity coming from wind and solar, if 63% is coming from burning coal, and they don't plan to eliminate that in the coming decades.
Okay, Mark, I think we're past an hour now. This has been a fascinating, broad-ranging conversation. Real pleasure having you back. And I do look forward to bringing you back after I've had a chance to maybe get through the preprint of your book. So I'll be definitely asking you to share that with me.
I'd love to talk about the book. As I said, I talk about energy in the book, but I'm much more interested in energy in the book as a derivative subject, in the sense that our demand for energy is derivative to our inventions of technologies that use energy primarily, right? We invent cars not because they make energy, they consume it. So the question that's interesting to me are, what are the new technologies that are bubbling up, that are being produced, and that will change our life in meaningful ways? So I focus on the things that we care about, how we work. I mean, the technologies that change how we work, the technologies that change how we deal with our health in every sense, not just from a position of a physician, but healthcare broadly. And I also look at entertainment, because one of the gifts of technology and cheap energy is that humans have the opportunity to spend more time they have throughout all of history doing something that the Grundys of the world decry. We entertain ourselves. Tourism is a form of entertainment. I mean, people have liked to be entertained. They just haven't been able to afford entertainment. Now we spend $1 trillion a year globally. The global entertainment industry is $1 trillion business. I think that's wonderful. It will be a $10 trillion industry in another 10 or 20 years. And that's the kind of stuff that I find fun to write about and explore. Of course, it means we'll use a lot more energy because everything that has to do with entertainment involves consuming energy.
Right. All right. Well, we look forward to that, Mark. Thanks again for making the time.
Well, you're a gentleman and a scholar for having me on again. Thanks for bringing me back. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.